The instrument panel glowed faintly in the cramped cockpit as Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Hermann settled into the pilot's seat of a machine he had spent 3 years trying to destroy. It was July of 1943, and for the first time, the Luftwaffe test pilot wasn't looking through the gun sight of a Bf-109 at a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. He was sitting inside one. The Americans called it Wolf Hound. The Germans had recovered it nearly intact from a forced landing in France, and now, at the Rechlin test facility north of Berlin, Hermann's orders were simple: fly it, test it, find its weaknesses. What he discovered instead would fundamentally alter German fighter tactics and reveal a truth the Luftwaffe had been slow to accept: that American bombers were not the vulnerable, lumbering targets their propaganda had promised. The war in the summer of 1943 had reached a critical inflection point. The Royal Air Force had been bombing German cities by night for nearly 3 years, but it was the arrival of the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force that transformed the air war into something unprecedented. Beginning in August of 1942, American B-17 seconds and B-24 Liberators began striking targets across occupied Europe in broad daylight, operating on a doctrine that prioritized precision over the area bombing preferred by the British. The American theory was deceptively simple. Heavily armed bombers, flying in tight defensive formations, could protect themselves without fighter escort, penetrating deep into enemy territory to destroy specific industrial targets with unprecedented accuracy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress embodied this doctrine more completely than any other aircraft of its era. First flown in 1935 and continuously refined throughout the late 1930s, the B-17 entered combat service in 1941, carrying a defensive armament that seemed excessive by the standards of the time. Early models featured 5 machine gun positions. By the time the B-17F entered production in 1942, that number had grown to 10, and eventually 13 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each capable of firing between 700 and 800 rounds per minute, with an effective range exceeding 1,000 yards. The aircraft's name was no accident. To its American crews, the Flying Fortress was exactly that: a mobile gun platform that could defend itself against enemy fighters from nearly any angle. German fighter pilots in 1942 and early 1943 had been trained under a very different set of assumptions. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine for bomber interception had been developed primarily through experience against Soviet and British bombers, most of which carried significantly lighter defensive armament. A Heinkel He-111 or a Soviet Ilyushin DB-3, for instance, typically mounted 3 to 5 machine guns, often in manually operated positions with limited fields of fire. German pilots had learned to exploit these blind spots, approaching from angles where defensive fire was weakest or absent entirely. The standard attack profile involved a high-speed diving pass from above and behind, closing to within 200 meters before opening fire close enough to ensure hits, but supposedly beyond the effective range of return fire from the bomber's defensive guns. This doctrine had worked reasonably well against early daylight raids. In August of 1942, when the 8th Air Force launched its first heavy bomber mission against rail yards near Rouen in occupied France, 12 B-17 seconds struck the target, while 7 more created a diversion. German fighters engaged, but the results were inconclusive. The Americans lost no bombers. German pilots reported that the formations were difficult to penetrate and that defensive fire was heavier than anticipated, but these observations were initially dismissed as the typical caution of pilots facing a new adversary. The Luftwaffe's intelligence assessments characterized the B-17 as a large, slow target cruising speed approximately 180 miles per hour at altitude that would prove vulnerable once German fighters learned to coordinate their attacks properly. By early 1943, however, the arithmetic of bomber defense was becoming impossible to ignore. On January 27th, 53 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds attacked the naval base at Wilhelmshaven in the first American raid against a target inside Germany proper. The mission encountered fierce resistance. Luftwaffe fighters from JG-1 and JG-11 mounted repeated attacks, but the bombers' defensive fire proved devastating. German pilots reported being hit by return fire at ranges they had considered safe. Several fighters were destroyed before they could close to what German doctrine defined as effective firing distance. The Americans lost 3 bombers, but German losses exceeded that number, and for the first time, Luftwaffe commanders began to question whether their standard tactics would suffice against the American daylight offensive. The psychological impact of this reversal was profound. German fighter pilots had entered the war supremely confident in their training, their aircraft, and their tactical doctrines. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had proven superior to most opponents in Spain, Poland, France, and the early stages of the Eastern Front. The Focke-Wulf Fevue 190, introduced in 1941, was faster and more heavily armed than nearly any Allied fighter. German pilots were taught that their machines and their skills gave them inherent advantages. They attacked from positions of strength, but the B-17 seconds presented a problem that could not be solved through superior piloting or aggressive tactics alone. The defensive firepower was simply too dense, the formations too well coordinated. Closing to the distances required for accurate shooting meant entering a zone where the bombers' guns were equally effective, and there were 10 or 13 of them firing back. The Luftwaffe's initial response was to refine existing tactics rather than fundamentally rethink them. Fighter units experimented with different approach angles. Some pilots tried frontal attacks, reasoning that the B-17's nose was less heavily defended than its flanks or tail. This was partially correct. Early B-17Es and Fs carried fewer forward-firing guns, but frontal attacks required exceptional marksmanship and nerves, since the combined closing speed often exceeded 600 miles per hour, leaving only seconds to aim and fire before breaking away. Other pilots attempted beam attacks from directly abreast, hoping to catch the bomber in a brief window where overlapping defensive fire was less concentrated. Still others persisted with the traditional stern attack, but from greater distances, accepting reduced accuracy in exchange for reduced exposure to defensive fire. None of these adaptations proved entirely satisfactory. By spring of 1943, 8th Air Force raids were penetrating deeper into Germany with increasing frequency. The mission to Bremen on April 17th involved 115 bombers, the largest American raid to date. German fighters destroyed 16 B-17 seconds, but the attackers paid a heavy price. Luftwaffe losses exceeded 30 aircraft, and returning German pilots uniformly reported that the defensive fire from the bomber formations was far more effective than intelligence estimates had suggested. Something was wrong. Either German intelligence had drastically underestimated American defensive capabilities, or German pilots were making tactical errors that cost lives and aircraft. The only way to resolve the question was to test a captured B-17 under controlled conditions, to fly it as the Americans did, and measure its defensive envelope empirically. The opportunity arrived in late spring of 1943, when a B-17F, serial number 4230696, made a forced landing near the French coast after suffering damage during a raid on Saint-Nazaire. The crew destroyed what they could before abandoning the aircraft, but the airframe remained largely intact. German recovery teams transported it to the Luftwaffe testing center at Rechlin, where a team of mechanics and engineers spent weeks repairing battle damage and restoring the bomber to flight status. They repainted it in Luftwaffe colors and gave it a new designation, Wolfhound. By early July, the aircraft was ready for evaluation. Oberleutnant Hermann, an experienced test pilot and combat veteran with over 400 missions, was selected to conduct the flight tests. Hermann's first impression upon inspecting the aircraft was one of overwhelming complexity. German bombers like the Heinkel He 111 or the Junkers Ju 88 typically carried crews of 4: pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner. The B-17 required a crew of 10. Walking through the fuselage, Hermann counted gun positions everywhere. 2 in the nose, 1 in a top turret just behind the cockpit, 1 in a ball turret beneath the fuselage, 1 in each waist window, and 2 in the tail. The guns themselves were Browning M, 2 heavy machine guns, each belt-fed from ammunition boxes containing hundreds of rounds. The sheer volume of ammunition stored aboard was staggering, typically 4,000 to 5,000 rounds total, weighing well over a ton. This was not a bomber that carried defensive weapons as an afterthought. The B-17 was designed from the outset to fight its way to the target and back. The flight tests began with basic handling characteristics. Hermann took the B-17 aloft over the Baltic Sea, accompanied by a Bf-109 chase plane to provide reference points and simulate attack runs. Once at altitude, Hermann put the bomber through a series of maneuvers to assess its performance envelope. The B-17 was indeed slow by fighter standards. Maximum speed at 25,000 feet was approximately 287 miles per hour, and it cruised at closer to 180. It was also large and relatively unmaneuverable. Bank angles were limited, and tight turns bled off airspeed quickly. In these respects, German intelligence had been correct. The B-17 was not going to outrun or outturn a pursuing fighter. But then came the defensive gunnery trials, and Hermann's understanding shifted. With the chase plane simulating attack runs from various angles, Hermann coordinated with German gunners stationed at each position inside the B-17. The results were sobering. From nearly every approach vector, at least 2 and often 3 or 4 guns could be brought to bear. The top turret, equipped with twin 50s and powered by an electric hydraulic system, could rotate 360 degrees and elevate to 90 degrees, covering the entire upper hemisphere. The ball turret beneath the fuselage provided similar coverage below. The waist gunners covered the beam approaches. The tail guns commanded the entire aft sector. And even frontal attacks, which German pilots had hoped might offer a safer approach, were met by fire from the nose guns and, if the attack angle was slightly off-center, the top turret as well. What struck Hermann most forcefully was not just the number of guns, but their coordination and overlapping fields of fire. American bomber formations didn't fly as individuals. They flew in tight defensive boxes, with aircraft staggered at slightly different altitudes so that the defensive fire from multiple bombers could interlock. A fighter attacking one bomber might find itself under fire from 3 or 4 others simultaneously. The effective defensive radius wasn't just the range of one aircraft's guns, it was the combined envelope of an entire formation. German fighters trying to close to effective firing range had to penetrate this layered defense, and the mathematics were brutal. Even if defensive gunnery accuracy was relatively low, estimates suggested American gunners hit perhaps 1 or 2% of the time under combat conditions. The sheer volume of fire created a probabilistic kill zone that no amount of individual pilot skill could entirely negate. Hermann compiled his findings into a detailed technical report for Luftwaffe High Command. The document, submitted in late July of 1943, made uncomfortable reading for German tacticians. The B-17's defensive armament was not merely heavy, it was intelligently designed to eliminate the blind spots that German pilots had exploited against other bombers. The report included specific measurements of gun traverse angles, rates of fire, and effective ranges. Hermann noted that the 50 caliber Browning had a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,800 feet per second, significantly higher than the standard German MG-15 or MG-131 defensive weapons used on Luftwaffe bombers. This translated to flatter trajectories and greater effective range. At distances where German pilots expected to be outside the danger zone, they were in fact well within the B-17's defensive envelope. The report recommended fundamental changes to German fighter tactics. Traditional stern attacks from 200 meters were essentially suicidal when attempted against B-17 formations. The tail guns alone, twin 50 calibers with excellent fields of fire, could easily track and engage fighters at that range, and if the attacker survived the tail guns, he would immediately come under fire from the dorsal and ventral turrets of adjacent bombers in the formation. Herman suggested that effective attacks required either much greater closing speeds, achieved through near-vertical diving attacks from high altitude, or standoff weapons that allowed fighters to engage from beyond the range of defensive fire. Neither option was particularly appealing. High-speed diving attacks were difficult to execute accurately and left little time for aiming. Standoff weapons like rockets or heavy cannon were still experimental and had their own limitations. The Luftwaffe's response to Herman's findings revealed the institutional resistance that often accompanies uncomfortable truths. Some commanders took the report seriously and began experimenting with new tactics. Others dismissed it as defeatist. There was a tendency, particularly among senior officers who had not personally flown against B-17 formations, to attribute German losses to pilot error or insufficient aggression rather than to any inherent advantage possessed by American bombers. The Nazi ideology that pervaded the German military establishment made it psychologically difficult to acknowledge that the enemy had designed and built a superior weapons system. American industrial capacity was supposed to prioritize quantity over quality. American engineering was supposed to be inferior to German precision. The B-17 challenged both assumptions, yet combat losses continued to mount, and the evidence became impossible to ignore. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Double Strike, simultaneous raids against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt production facility at Regensburg. A total of 376 bombers participated, the largest American mission to date. German fighter defenses mobilized en masse. Over 300 Luftwaffe fighters engaged the bombers, and the resulting air battle stretched across southern Germany for hours. The Americans lost 60 bombers, 16% of the attacking force, a devastating toll by any measure. But German losses exceeded that number, with estimates ranging from 65 to over 100 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair, along with dozens of experienced pilots killed or wounded. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission marked a turning point in the air war, though not in the way German commanders hoped. The heavy American losses seemed to validate the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, and there was brief optimism that sustained attrition might force the Americans to abandon daylight bombing altogether. But the mathematics of the exchange told a different story. Germany could not afford to trade fighters and pilots at a 1-to-1 ratio with American bombers, much less at rates approaching 2-to-1. The Luftwaffe was a finite force defending an entire continent. The 8th Air Force could replace losses through American industrial production, which by mid-1943 was delivering hundreds of new heavy bombers every month. Boeing's production facilities in Seattle, Douglas plants in California, and the massive consolidated Vultee factory in Texas were collectively producing B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down, even in its most successful engagements. German pilots who survived multiple encounters with B-17 formations developed a profound respect bordering on dread for the American bombers' defensive firepower. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Jonen, a night fighter pilot occasionally pressed into daylight interception duty, later described attacking a B-17 formation as flying into a cloud of lead. Another pilot, Lieutenant Heinz Nock, wrote in his diary after a mission in October of 1943 that the bomber formations seemed to bristle with guns, and that the tracers from their defensive fire created a web through which German fighters had to navigate, knowing that for every tracer round visible, 4 or 5 non-tracer rounds travelled the same path invisibly. The psychological burden was immense. Fighter pilots are trained to be aggressive, to close with the enemy and press attacks home. But natural human survival instinct recoils from deliberately flying into concentrated fire, and the cognitive dissonance between training and instinct created stress that accumulated over repeated missions. The Luftwaffe attempted various technical solutions to the tactical problem posed by American defensive firepower. One approach was to increase the armament of German fighters, mounting heavier cannon that could theoretically destroy bombers from greater distances. The standard Bf-109E and F models carried one 20mm cannon and two machine guns. Later variants added more guns, and by 1943, some fighters were being equipped with 30mm cannon or even underwing rocket tubes. The theory was sound. Heavier weapons meant German fighters could engage from beyond the effective range of the B-17s' 50-caliber guns. In practice, however, the modifications created new problems. The additional weight reduced the fighter's speed and maneuverability, making it more vulnerable to American escort fighters when they eventually arrived. The larger weapons also had lower rates of fire and required more precise aiming, which was extremely difficult when attacking a maneuvering bomber at high speed. Another approach involved developing specialized bomber-destroyer aircraft. The Messerschmitt Me 4-10, a heavy twin-engine fighter, was designed specifically to break up bomber formations using heavy forward-firing armament, including 30mm cannon and, in some variants, 50mm cannon adapted from tank guns. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was modified with underwing mortar tubes that could lob time-fused explosive shells into bomber formations from relatively safe distances. These weapons showed occasional effectiveness, but they were not war-winning innovations. The Me 4-10 was too slow and unmaneuverable to survive once American long-range escort fighters, like the P-47 Thunderbolt and later the P-51 Mustang, began accompanying bombers deep into Germany. The mortar-equipped W-190s required precise timing and favorable attack angles to be effective, and their success rate remained modest. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fundamental problem was that the B-17's defensive design philosophy had been correct. The Americans had understood something that the Germans, despite their tactical sophistication and combat experience, had initially missed, that in daylight bombing, the bomber's best defense was not speed or altitude or evasion, but concentrated firepower organized into mutually supporting formations. Each B-17 carried approximately 4,500 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition. A formation of 50 bombers carried over 200,000 rounds. Even if defensive accuracy was low, the sheer volume of fire created a probabilistic barrier that ensured attackers would take losses regardless of their skill or tactics. The question was never whether German fighters could destroy individual bombers. They could, and did, in significant numbers. The question was whether they could do so at an exchange rate that Germany could sustain. The answer, increasingly clear by late 1943, was no. The captured B-17 at Rechlin continued to serve as a training aid throughout 1943 and into 1944. German fighter pilots were given orientation flights to familiarize themselves with the bomber's blind spots, the few that existed, and to understand the constraints under which American gunners operated. They learned, for instance, that the ball turret gunner had limited visibility when the turret was rotated toward the rear, and that there was a narrow cone beneath and behind the aircraft where fire from the ball turret and tail guns could not effectively converge. They learned that the top turret gunner's field of fire was obstructed by the tail when the turret faced aft. These were useful tactical insights, but they did not fundamentally alter the strategic reality. The defensive gaps in a single B-17 were minimal, and when multiple bombers flew in formation, even those small gaps were covered by adjacent aircraft. By early 1944, the air war had evolved in ways that made German tactical adaptations largely irrelevant. The introduction of long-range escort fighters, first the P-47 with drop tanks, then the P-38 Lightning, and finally the P-51 Mustang, with sufficient range to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, transformed the calculus of daylight bombing. German fighters attempting to attack bomber formations now had to first fight their way through screens of American escorts. The Luftwaffe's numerical strength was being eroded, not just by combat losses, but by fuel shortages, as Allied bombing systematically destroyed synthetic fuel production facilities across Germany. Pilot quality declined as training programs were shortened and experienced veterans were killed faster than they could be replaced. The initiative had passed irrevocably to the Allies. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots during this period was profound and multifaceted. Many experienced a growing sense of futility. They were still shooting down American bombers, sometimes in significant numbers, but the raids continued unabated. For every formation turned back or mauled, 2 more appeared the next day or the day after. The industrial disparity that Hermann Göring had once dismissed as irrelevant was manifesting as an inexorable material reality. American factories were producing heavy bombers at a rate of several per day. Germany's aircraft production, despite heroic efforts to disperse factories and maintain output under constant bombing, could not keep pace with losses. The Luftwaffe was being ground down not in a single catastrophic defeat but through sustained attrition across thousands of missions. Some pilots developed a grim fatalism. They continued to fly and fight because the alternative, allowing the bombers free passage, was unthinkable. Others became increasingly cynical about the propaganda that had promised German technological superiority and inevitable victory. The disconnect between official narratives and observable reality created cognitive dissonance that eroded morale more effectively than any Allied bombing raid. When pilots who had flown against B-17 formations returned to base and heard propaganda ministry broadcasts describing American equipment as inferior and American aircrews as poorly trained, the gap between rhetoric and experience became impossible to ignore. There were, of course, individual success stories. Some German pilots became highly effective bomber hunters, developing techniques that minimized their exposure to defensive fire while maximizing their chances of inflicting critical damage. Major Egon Meyer pioneered head-on attacks against B-17 formations in late 1942 and early 1943, reasoning correctly that the nose was the least defended sector of early B-17 models. His tactic involved approaching the formation at high speed from 12 o'clock level, firing a brief burst from maximum range and diving away before the bomber's defensive fire could track him effectively. Meyer trained other pilots in this technique, and for a time it proved devastatingly effective, but the Americans adapted. Beginning with the B-17G model introduced in late 1943, Boeing added a chin turret beneath the nose with twin 50-caliber guns specifically to counter frontal attacks. The tactical advantage evaporated within months. The experience of captured or interrogated American bomber crews provided additional insights that German intelligence found both valuable and disconcerting. American airmen expressed confidence in their aircraft and their formation's defensive capabilities. They acknowledged that German fighters were dangerous and that losses were significant, but they did not express the kind of existential fear that might indicate their tactics were fundamentally flawed. When questioned about defensive gunnery, American gunners consistently emphasized training and coordination. They practiced extensively in flexible gunnery, using gun cameras and ground targets to develop accuracy. They rehearsed formation flying until the defensive boxes became instinctive. The 8th Air Force had created a system, organizational, technical, and tactical, that maximized the B-17's inherent strengths. German attempts to replicate aspects of American defensive doctrine with their own bombers revealed how difficult it was to implement such systems without the underlying industrial and organizational tools, infrastructure. The Heinkel He 177, introduced in 1942 as Germany's attempt at a heavy bomber, carried significantly heavier defensive armament than earlier German bombers, including powered turrets similar to those on the B-17. But production problems plagued the He-177 program. The aircraft required complex systems and high-quality materials that German industry struggled to provide in sufficient quantities, especially as Allied bombing disrupted supply chains. By late 1943, German bomber production was being scaled back to prioritize fighters for homeland defense. The strategic initiative had shifted so completely that Germany no longer had the luxury of conducting its own daylight bombing campaigns. The captured B-17 at Rechlin flew its last test mission in early 1944. By that point, the lessons it had taught were well understood, even if solutions remained elusive. The aircraft was eventually scrapped for parts as fuel shortages made even training flights increasingly difficult to justify. Oberleutnant Hermann, the pilot who had conducted the initial evaluation flights, survived the war, though his career took a different path. In late 1943, he pioneered the wild-boar night fighting tactics that used single-engine fighters to attack British bombers over illuminated German cities. His contributions to German defensive doctrine were significant, but they could not alter the fundamental trajectory of the air war. The broader strategic implications of the B-17's defensive effectiveness became fully apparent only after the war, when historians and analysts could examine the complete picture. The American daylight bombing campaign achieved its objectives not through any single decisive battle but through cumulative attrition that Germany could not match. Between 1943 and 1945, the 8th Air Force alone flew over 350,000 bomber sorties, delivering approximately 700,000 tons of bombs on German targets. The cost was enormous, over 26,000 American airmen killed and thousands more wounded or captured. But the campaign systematically destroyed Germany's capacity to wage industrialized war. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, rail networks, and eventually entire cities were reduced to rubble. The defensive firepower of the B-17 and B-24 bombers made this campaign possible. Without effective defensive armament, daylight bombing at the scale the Americans attempted would have resulted in prohibitive losses, forcing a shift to night operations or abandonment of the strategic bombing offensive altogether. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun, mounted in groups of 10 or 13 per aircraft and coordinated through formation tactics, created a defensive bubble that German fighters could penetrate only at severe cost. This was not the result of any single technical innovation, but rather the integration of multiple systems, aircraft design, weapon performance, crew training, formation tactics, and industrial capacity into a coherent operational doctrine. For German pilots who flew against these formations day after day throughout 1943 and 1944, the psychological burden was immense. They were caught between impossible demands ordered to stop the American bombers, knowing that every attack meant flying into concentrated defensive fire, and aware that even successful attacks merely delayed the inevitable. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots were among the most skilled and experienced in the world, products of rigorous training and ruthless combat selection. But skill alone could not overcome the structural disadvantages they faced. They were outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outgunned. The admission that German pilots came to make, though rarely explicitly, and often only among themselves, was that the American defensive firepower was overwhelming. This was not a comfortable conclusion for warriors trained to believe in their own superiority and the inferiority of their enemies. It contradicted the propaganda they had absorbed and the ideological framework that sustained their war effort. But it was a conclusion forced upon them by repeated exposure to the reality of combat against B-17 formations. The captured B-17 at Rechlin had provided empirical confirmation of what combat experience had already begun to teach: that the Americans had designed and built a weapons system specifically optimized for the mission it was assigned, and that no amount of tactical cleverness or individual bravery could fully negate its advantages. In the final accounting, the story of German pilots flying captured B-17 seconds is a story about the collision between expectation and reality, between doctrine and evidence. The Luftwaffe entered the conflict against American daylight bombers with tactics proven effective against other opponents and with confidence in German technological and tactical superiority. The B-17 challenged both assumptions. It was not invulnerable. Over 4,700 B-17 seconds were lost in combat during the war, but it was far more survivable than German doctrine had anticipated. Its defensive firepower, when properly employed in coordinated formations, created a tactical environment where every attack carried significant risk and where aggregate losses favored the attacker despite local German successes. The lessons learned from evaluating the captured B-17 spread through the Luftwaffe's fighter force, but they came too late to alter the war's trajectory. By the time German pilots fully understood the capabilities they faced, the strategic situation had evolved beyond the point where tactical adaptations could make a decisive difference. The arrival of long-range escort fighters, the erosion of German fuel supplies, and the progressive destruction of German industry through sustained bombing created conditions where even perfect tactics could not compensate for material inferiority. The air war became a war of attrition, and in wars of attrition, industrial capacity ultimately determines outcomes. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.